Stigma somehow shores up our sense of security. It gives us permission not to help, and it justifies our hard-heartedness. Stigma works in the same way for mental health challenges. It reduces people to a diagnosis. When illness becomes a person, a source of fear, a source of anxiety for how we interact and engage, then their primary identity as one who God welcomes gets lost. Our series this month is Mercy and Hope. And my question for you this morning is, who needs that kind of message? Who needs a message of mercy? Who needs a message of hope the most? It's those who've received very little mercy. It's those who are close to giving up on hope. Those are the ones who need to be reminded that there is mercy and hope offered to them. And in our society, and even in our church, sadly, the ones who need to be reminded that there is mercy and hope are the ones who are marginalized, the ones who are ostracized for several different reasons. So we go back to the story of the Gospels. We always go back to Jesus. So the Gospel of John, chapter 9, is where we're going to be today. We encounter an individual that most people don't notice. And if they do notice him, they're not talking to him, but they're talking about him. And they might know of him. It's clear in the story that people kind of know who he is, but they don't really know him. His name isn't even mentioned. They don't see him as a person, as a human, as an individual. They see him as a diagnosis. Humanity reduces him to the thinnest, most singular quality. It's a hollow label. He is the blind beggar. Jesus, in contrast, notices. John 9, verse 1 says, while walking along the road, Jesus sees a man who is blind since birth. This word is not innocuous. It is used countless times in the Old Testament to describe the God who sees the plight of his children. In fact, it's Hagar, who is the concubine of Abraham, who first identifies God and names him. You are the one who sees me. Rejected, abandoned, dismissed, exiled. You are the God who sees me. And seeing here means not just attending to the reality, as in there is a person sitting on the side of the road who is blind from birth. This seeing goes much deeper. It doesn't let the prejudice or the busyness or fear prevent Jesus from recognizing the persona, the child behind the label. To see him as it would be a fellow human being. This is our incarnate God who wears the flesh of humanity. Now, despite this being a very religious community, superstitions abounded. And this superstitious belief came in many different cultures and many different religions from the idea that wrongdoing must be punished in this life. That every affliction was a direct penalty of some mishap, of some sin, of some error, of some fault. And it was either because of the person afflicted or their parents' sin. And it's true that what we suffer, the calamities, the ailments, the struggles, are a result of sin, large-scale rebellion against God's way, a break from his calling, a break from his directives. But this truth has become perverted. Satan, who is the originator and author of sin and all of its effects, is the one who blames God for disease and death, and as arbitrarily punisher of those who would fail him. Hence, those who suffer any kind of ailment have this additional burden, not of carrying the consequences of their sickness or their disease or their setbacks, but also the added burden of being accused guilty of some crime. God gave us a lesson to prevent this. A lot of scholars will say the book of Job actually predates the writings of Moses, so that the very first scripture that was shared and passed and retold in communities was this story that would inoculate us against this perception that God is against us. The story of Job illustrates point blank that it is Satan himself manifesting curses, manifesting disasters in the life of Job, and that it is God who intervenes and vindicates him and shows him mercy. Somehow, though, prevailing ideas have taken hold, and even in Jesus' day, they lost the message of Job, and they're responding to this superstition, this idea that if someone is blind, it's got to be caused by something. It's almost a type of karma. So they ask him, "Teacher, who sinned? Who is responsible for this man's blindness?" Because he's born blind. So it kind of challenges already their presupposition that it's a result of direct sin. How could an innocent fetus commit some kind of sin? So is it the parents' sin? And even then, they're kind of, I think, wrestling with, this seems unfair. This seems unjust. Jesus tries to set the matter straight, and his response is neither. His blindness cannot be traced to a particular person's sin. Instead, he's blind so that the deeds of God, the works of God, might be displayed. For whenever I am in the world, I am light of the world. Jesus responds to this question, to this case, by seizing an opportunity to turn the association with blindness on its head. In doing so, the negative stigmas and associations we put on anyone who is less than or othered. Jesus then treats this man as an important agent in communicating God's character and his gospel. He speaks to him directly, and I can only imagine what it must have been like for that man who the very first encounter with Jesus is the sound of his voice. He hears the directive. Well, actually, then he feels the clay and the mud, because Jesus has spit in the ground and he's mixing his saliva with the dirt to form some kind of mud. And so you're hearing a voice, I'm sure, reassuring you, just hold still. This won't hurt. I've got you. These words are recorded in Scripture, but I can only imagine that Jesus is treating this man with the utmost compassion and gentleness. What is recorded is his next directive: go wash yourself in the pool of Siloam. Now, Siloam means sent. So he sends him to the pool of sent. And this is multi-layered because he is being reminded that his healing is sent by God. His sight is a gift sent by God, but also it's foreshadowing that this blind beggar is going to be sent to proclaim the goodness of God. It's interesting to me, too, that he commands the blind man, go to the pool. So oftentimes when people are struggling, whether it's a physical disability or another type of ailment, we kind of over champion them. Oh, you're such a great hero. Wow, you just inspire me so much, the way you just persist every single day and, get yourself up and go to work. That's what humans do. Sometimes when we over coddle or we overemphasize just the things that are now normal and that people are capable of doing, even if they have to incorporate adaptation and support. You don't need to belittle them in that overemphasis and over championing them, but to recognize that they're doing it in their own strength and their own humanity and their own perseverance. So Jesus here is so empowering. He knows this man can get himself to the pool. And instead of leading him by the hand and over coddling them, he's bolstering this sense of confidence, an awakened confidence that I see past your diagnosis. I see past your limitation. I'm affirming what you're capable of. I'm affirming you for who you are. He sends them to the pool, and we see that where others have given disregard, where others have devalued this individual, and Jesus sees him and treats him like an adult. He treats him as somebody who is capable of participating in his own healing. And so then we move from this thin perspective, this one-line label, to something that's a bit thicker, a bit fuller, a bit richer when it comes to recognizing the identity. It's a lot harder for the bystanders, the community members, to follow Jesus' lead. When the man comes back from washing in the pool and his sight is restored, it says the townspeople, or some translations might say the neighbors, were talking amongst themselves. Isn't this the guy we see sitting and begging on the streets? Yeah, it's the same man. No, it can't be him, but it looks so much like him. How have your eyes been opened, they ask. And the man who was formerly blind says, a man named Jesus approached me, and he made mud in the ground, applied it to my eyes, and said, go wash yourself in the pool of Siloam. And when I went and washed, I could suddenly see. They're stuck. They're stuck in their previous labels of how they treat him. And even though he's clearly a changed man, even though something is different about his eyes, about the way he can maneuver, they're still questioning. They're still holding on to this doubt. They're still holding on to the label. He's challenging these misconceptions. He refuses to succumb to their prejudice and their projections. Scripture says these neighbors, it doesn't say his friends or his family. There is nobody who really was well acquainted with him. This is not like the cripple whose friends carted him on a cot and lowered him through the roof. This guy had nobody. So it's just the townspeople, the neighbors, are questioning, is this guy for real? So they take him to the Pharisees. We're at the synagogue. It happens to be the Sabbath. And the debate continues. They didn't know how this should be. And they start to think like, well, if this happened, it somehow is breaking the Sabbath rules. Ironically, the ones that are scheming and they know that this is Jesus. They know that this is the one that has been talked about as the promised Messiah. They know that he is claiming to have been sent by God himself. They know something is different and special about this man, but they're trying to find every reason to find fault with him. So something as ridiculous as bringing healing and hope on the Sabbath, they are going through their rule books and arguing and finding ways that this presents itself as a great offense and that this would expose Jesus Messiah as a fraud, as a scam artist. Ironically, those who are so zealous in pinning the blame on Jesus for breaking the Sabbath and proper Sabbath protocol are in the back of their minds plotting murder against him. Which is the greater Sabbath offense? To bring hope and healing to others, to relieve the burdens of others, or to plot their death? So the Pharisees call for the parents of the blind man. They need other witnesses. They want to confirm these facts. There's the man himself declaring that he has been blind and his sight is restored, we see this dismissiveness. Well, can you really speak for yourself? Can we really trust you who was afflicted, who was othered, who is simply known as a blind beggar? There's not even the value or the worth for him to declare and speak his own truth. So powerful is prejudice. So distorting is self-righteousness. Jesus shares in the pain of this blind man. He knows exactly the dismissiveness that he's experienced. Jesus himself was the target of false assumptions and judgment. The Pharisees are bantering and debating, and they say, oh, we know that God spoke to Moses, but we don't really know where this guy comes from. That's a slight and a dig at his history, being born of a virgin. Really? Really? Jesus and this blind man are both victims of tragic misconceptions. But isn't it good news for us? When we are sick or we want to go see a counselor or a therapist, often we want to find somebody who has lived a similar experience to us. Imagine getting the diagnosis of cancer and then discovering that your oncologists themselves have gone through it and beat it. That is going to give you so much more encouragement, and it's going to resonate you and build trust with this physician. That is exactly what Jesus did in his incarnational presentation. He has gone through every suffering, every sorrow, every rejection that we ourselves face, every pain. He understands. And so our physician, our high priest, as scripture refers elsewhere, knows, empathizes, understands, and that is to build within us a great confidence, a great trust in the one who we're going to seek healing and restoration from. Now the Pharisees, they're in a pickle because of their prejudice and their refusal to believe the facts of the case, to acknowledge the evidence right in front of them. There's a different vision that's occurring. There's a different eye opening that's occurring. The crowd starts to see. Their eyes are open. Wow, these Pharisees, these leaders, these expositors of scripture, of God's writing, there's something plainly going on here. There's something divine and supernatural unfolding here. The dots are connecting, and yet who's the blind one? Who's refusing to see it? And so through this miracle of giving sight back to a blind man, to the whole community's eyes start to open to a new understanding of Jesus and the kingdom he represents. The Pharisees think that they're just dealing with some uneducated blind man. What could a beggar know? What could this guy understand? And as they continue to grill him, we read in his response, again, this conviction and this confidence that's growing. It's God's divine power that's causing him to even challenge these leaders of the day. And he says, I've explained myself already, and you don't want to hear. He just calls it like it is. I'm sure he's thinking, why am I wasting my breath in this moment when I could be singing the praises of the God who healed me and sharing this good news, and I'm stuck in the courts of the Pharisees? His reasoning is unanswerable. He finally stumps the Pharisees. The parents who are called say, yes, this is our son, but we weren't there when the healing took place. If he says it happened, it happened. They kind of bow out of any accountability or responsibility to this. And so the priests are dumbfounded. They're backed into a corner, and I can just see them start to frown and furrow their brows even more, to wring their hands as that kind of anger stirs up within them. They are pinned in. shaking the dust from their feet, grabbing their robes, walking off in a huff as they hurl final insults and judgment at this man, still hanging on to his condition. Sinner. Who are you to tell us anything? You were born blind, once a sinner, always a sinner. And they banish him from the synagogue. It's an excommunication. It's not the end of the story, though, but I'm going to save it for next week because I want you to come back and we'll talk about how Jesus responds to religious trauma. But for now, I want us to think about the healing that took place of this man. And how while this is not a story about mental health, it could easily be. The principles hold true. Humans are created to be friends of God and then friends with each other. And any time that a barrier compromises those relationships, we start to shrivel. We start to suffer. That God would intend for us to be well connected with Him is going to have that ripple effect in being well connected with others. And when both of those take place, we have a flourishing life. So humanity's efforts, our collective efforts as a faith community, what we are called to do in discipleship is to work on restoring this relationship dynamic. Jesus did what He could to restore the relationship and the break between us and the Father. And now as we lean into that, it echoes and it ripples out and it parallels restoring the connection we have with one another. Samuel Wells states this theological dynamic so well. It says, for Jesus, our real problem as human beings is our alienation from God and one another. And that's what Jesus changes. He looks at anyone who feels alienated and He embraces them. He reminds them that they are welcome. He reminds them that He died for them. And throughout His short 3-year ministry, we see time and time again His compassionate concern and His confrontation to stigma, speaking directly about restoring the fullness of humanity when it's been reduced to a single label. To see people beyond their broken condition, their compromised condition, their corrupted condition, to the child of God that they are. And He takes fullest aim, fullest issue with our behavior towards others. Jesus, in contrast, He's the one who sees, He's the one who notices, He makes space and He empowers the suffering individual. He believes in Him. He believes that He can articulate His own understanding in life. He believes that He can be a witness of the gospel and share His limited understanding of God in a powerful way. The healing makes little difference in the attitudes of those around Him because stigma sticks beyond reason and beyond confrontation. The crowd has some kind of vested interest in maintaining this perception. They reject all alternative explanations. Stigma somehow shores up our sense of security. It gives us permission not to help, and it justifies our hard-heartedness. Stigma works in the same way for mental health challenges. It reduces people to a diagnosis, to certain behaviors or conditions. And when people are no longer identified as people, but as a pathology, when illness becomes a person, a source of fear, a source of anxiety for how we interact and engage, then their primary identity as one who God welcomes gets lost. To follow the way of Jesus is to nurture a community that would welcome and extend hospitality, making space for the fullness and the potential of the people in our midst. It means becoming more aware of how we might be projecting ourselves, becoming more aware of barriers, maybe not intentioned, but that do exist. It means going beyond the surface and seeing someone with a different challenge and a struggle as someone who still has a rich spiritual journey, and to see them as someone who might just reveal something about God that we've missed. So how can our church be a place where it's okay to not be okay and still champion our vision that the love of Jesus can transform your life for the better? How can we hold fast to this idea that we become, we move in a direction of healing in the presence of Jesus, and yet still acknowledge the reality that that journey might be one step forward and 2 steps back? We have a lot of work to do on that. One thing is to change how we use language, even in joking or making light of something. We have to acknowledge that we defer to terms like, oh, they're a wacko, a Looney Tune, that even in humor, those are pieces of language that divide and not bridge, that further amplify the stigma that could be felt personally as the individual wrestles with their own self-esteem, or interpersonally in who they can trust, who they can be open with. And in institutions, in communities larger than that. To that end, our church is doing something special at the beginning of April. We're hosting a 4-part seminar. You may have seen the MindFit advertising when you came in. And it's addressing mental health because there's still a huge stigma about it. In 2019, before the pandemic hit, Dr. Tam identified for the state of Canada that stigma was a huge barrier in people getting the help that they needed. They were so fearful of what that doctor would say, or what a friend would say, or what a parent would say, or what their manager would say, that many people were suffering alone, and their conditions were worsened because they didn't know it was safe to speak out and to talk about it and get help. We have a good God to point people to, even when we have failed each other in being supportive, in being compassionate, in being open-minded and inclusive. Our God has illustrated and demonstrated that he never failed in those areas. He's got his arms open wide to embrace everyone who has felt stigmatized and ostracized. Are we going to join him in that?